Discussions on abortion can be some of the most philosophically fruitful, yet some of the most colloquially vacuous ones. And this is rightly because discussions of abortion bring up a lot of uncomfortable questions that we don't always have ready-made answers for. In thinking about abortion and its place in the public rhetoric politically today, I think that it's really important that we actually nail down philosophically some discourse in which we can engage in arguments about abortion. I think that this is a very important debate and one that shows the centrality of lived experience to philosophical discussion. And in this lecture, I would like to discuss some of the questions really central to the discourse surrounding abortion. What is a human life? What makes life valuable? Where does life begin? All of these are really important questions in terms of nailing down how we feel towards abortion, and I think that this lecture can hopefully serve as a starting off point for discussions on abortion. I've got some notes with me today because I think that if any discussion merits notes, it's this one. And I'm going to come out right at the start here and tell you that I support abortion as a right. Not only do I think that we can justify it, I think that it is a right that all women have, and I think that it's important that we get out at the start of our discussions just the way that we actually feel about this, not skirt around the bush, and highlight that, for example, one of the fundamental things that determines our stance towards abortion is how one feels dispositionally towards posterity. Now, I am not one who is going to typically invoke posterity to justify my ethical decisions. I'm much more concerned with the imminent implications of our actions right now. And this is just how I am dispositionally. Others care much more for the future and are more forward-thinking, and this is a valid way to think about things. I think it's important that we bring this to the forefront of our discussions to show the way in which our understanding of truth and the way in which we engage in philosophical discussion has a lot to do with our dispositions and our values as much as it does about knowledge or truth. But that being said, let's just get right into this. In order to understand what human life is, we need to enter into a discussion of ontology. Ontology being the philosophy of being. What makes things be, what allows them to be, and talk about them in a determinate way. When we talk about humans, of course, in the abortion discussion, the question is whether or not a fetus is a human. What sort of qualities and properties determine something as human? And we need to ask, with regards to human life, is the whole greater than the sum of its parts? Aristotle, in his Politics, brings up a sort of question such as this when determining what it means to be a citizen of a state. He says that the classic notion is that to be a citizen is to be a member of a particular location. You're within the state and thus you're a citizen. But he quickly brings up a sort of defeater, which is that what about resident aliens or slaves, both of which he does not see as citizens. Certainly, he says, citizenship is more than just location. And we can bring up similar defeaters for this notion of humans as the sum of our parts. If to be a human is to be this thing with 2 eyes, 2 ears, a nose, a head, 2 arms and 2 legs, etc., 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 then it would seem that by this logic, an amputee is less human, and less human in proportion to the amount of body parts which have been amputated. So an amputee who has lost 1 arm is less human, and the amputee who has lost 2 arms is less human by twice the amount that the single amputee is, and so on and so forth. But just intuitively, this seems false. We would like to think that disabled people are just as human as the rest of us. They have some sort of sense of human dignity. And this notion of human dignity brings to the fore what might be that which makes us greater than the sum of our parts. For some, this is some notion of human nature or the soul, something that makes us greater than the mere material conditions that make us up. And I think that if we want to figure out any line between human and non-human life in order to determine what might make us special and thus have some sort of value, if we even want to talk about the soul or human nature or anything like that, we need to recognize that there are a number of ambiguities and exceptions to life that should make us call into question the notion that life begins at conception. This is the common argument by those who are pro-life, that abortion is always wrong because it is murder, because life begins at conception. So they say conception is the beginning of a process harboring and developing the future potential of life. And to cease it at any point is to effectively deny that future human its chance at life. Now, I think that there are a number of questions that this should bring to the fore, such as why choose conception as our arbitrary starting point of life? Why not go before that to, for example, sperm? If sperm are one of the basic building blocks that allow for the creation of a fetus, and this sperm is thus a continuous part of the potential to life that is being brought out, then why not consider ejaculation a form of reckless abandon, a form of genocide? We quickly get to the point where this notion of where life starts or ends becomes rather arbitrary. In thinking about where life ends, for example, when my body dies, the stuff in me is still living. There's still bacteria and viruses and different organs which are in the process of dying. But dying, just as living and growing, are processes. And the stuff that makes me up will diffuse into the environment and help to furnish future life. So we cannot actually locate some firm discontinuity before which life was not and after which life is. I think that in reality, with this notion of the potential for life, which is often used to bar anyone from supporting abortion, we need to be pragmatic about balancing between the future potentiality for life, which is the fetus, and the actual imminent lived reality of current lives, that being the mother. We need to think about, for example, when thinking about abortion, is the mother's life in danger or not? I think this brings to the fore a number of potential criteria that we typically invoke when we think about what is a valuable human life. Because, for example, the pro-lifer is going to say that, in fact, a fetus is valuable in and of itself. It bears some stamp of human value, for example. But I honestly don't see why we can say this. And in order to justify this, I would like to bring forth certain principles that are typically used by ethicists when determining, is something an ethical subject? Now, an ethical subject is an entity or a being which is seen as ethically worthwhile. It is something that we can partake in ethical reasoning with regards to. For example, we typically don't see cockroaches or bees as ethical subjects, but we do see humans as ethical subjects. Why? Well, I have here 6 criteria that I think are really central to our notion of ethical subjects. Firstly, we have the notion of agency, which is the ability to perform actions of one's own. Agency is key because in order for something to be an ethical subject, it has to be able to participate in ethical actions itself. Secondly, we have autonomy, which is the ability to act free of coercion. If I point a gun to your head and give you an either or, and one of the options involves me shooting you, that's not really an autonomous action. You're not free of coercion in order to, of your own accord, come to what is the right decision. We value autonomy and freedom of the ethical agent, when it comes to deciding whether or not something is good or not. Third, we have consciousness, which is the awareness of one's autonomy. Being aware of the fact that one is an ethical participant, that one's actions implicate others. Without consciousness, this is one of the ways that we determine, for example, whether or not it's ethical to kill another animal, whether or not they're conscious of their feeling pain, and things like this. Fourth, we have the capacity for empathy. This is something that's not often brought to the fore, but I think it's a really important element of our ethical reasoning, which is that in order for me to comport myself towards another in an ethical way, in order for me to engage in society, it requires that I have some ability of empathy, to put myself into another's shoes and imagine the implications of my actions, not simply in the abstract, but with regards to the imminent lived circumstances of another. If the agent to which I'm comporting myself is not one capable of feeling that lived implication, this would call into question the ability for me to say my action is wrong. Or if I myself cannot engage in this empathetic behavior, it gives one pause in order to think of me as a normal ethical subject. Think of someone with antisocial personality disorder, for example, who is not able to form empathetic connections with another. Well, we see this as a form of maladaptive psychology that leads us to consider them as an aberrant sort of ethical subject. They're still valuable. We still want to try to form some kind of connection or some form of rehabilitation, be that through drugs or therapy. But this is really important, the ability to empathize with another. And fifth, and very similar, is sociability. We value ethical subjects which participate in an ethical discourse by participating in society. Those who are recluses, who pretend that their actions do not implicate others and would like to retract themselves from society, are typically not seen as themselves deserving societal consideration. And sixth, we have the ability to consent. I put this last, but these are in no particular order. I think this may be one of the most important ones. The ability to consent to the encroachment of my rights, for example, is one of the principal means by which we determine whether or not an action is ethical. And furthermore, it must be informed consent. Because if, for example, I'm in a country where I am oppressed, say I'm a woman in Afghanistan, and I am forced to wear a niqab, and I'm told that this is as good as it gets, and that I should want this. Now, if I were to come from an American perspective, and another American is trying to say that, no, things are better, and I say to my American friend, well, no, they're perfectly satisfied, you see? What right do you have to come in and tell them that things should be different? Well, I would say that, in fact, if they don't know things could be different, then their satisfaction is not enough in order to say that they have informed consent to the conditions they're in. The niqabi women in Afghanistan, if they do not know that there is something better, deserves to have the open informational access that in fact something could be better. And in the same way, consent, and this is going to be important for my example in a few minutes, constant informed consent and the intake of information and the ability to always have consent is central to our ethical reasoning. Because there's a common counter-argument that's brought up here, which is that once conception has occurred, an irrevocable process towards the creation of a future life has started, and you have relinquished the right to interfere with this process now. The baby depends upon you as it develops in your womb. So in order to interfere with that process, you're basically like playing God. Now, in order to show the problems of this, imagine that I come up to you and I'm going to die if I do not plug hoses into you and siphon off your energy. I need your energy or I will die. And let's say, in fact, you consent to this at first. You say that, well, I recognize that I want to help furnish this life and help it to burgeon and develop, and you need me, and I willingly participate in this. Now, if you decide that you no longer want me parasitizing off your body, maybe you realize that this is just not in your best interests anymore, or it's going to kill you, or it's an inconvenience, or, there are all sorts of reasons that one could come for why you no longer want me parasitizing off your body. Well, if you decide to withdraw consent at this point, that is your prerogative, because consent is always primary. Because you are always constantly learning the true implications of your consent. Consent is always something which you have the ability to retract because you're constantly learning the outcomes of you initially giving your consent. It is constantly something which its consequences become apparent to you. And to say that at this initial point in which you give your consent, that is the final say-so, is to neglect the fact that our actions are constantly bringing forth implications into the future and constantly manifesting themselves. It's not just a one-off position, but rather, as is the gestational period of 9 months, there's a constant process of the developing implications on the mother's body and how this is going to play out in the future. And thus, at any point in this hypothetical instance in which I try to parasitize off you with these tubes, you always have the right to retract your consent, because consent is primary over the dependence that I may have upon you. As a result, even though a fetus doesn't have the ability, for example, of agency or autonomy or consciousness or capacity for empathy or sociability or consent, even though it doesn't have any of these, while one could argue that it would come into fruition in the future, I think at the very least, the imminent bodily threat to the mother is reason that one should be able to engage in abortion. At the very least, that should be something that we can agree upon. That the current imminent threat to the mother supersedes the hypothetical possibility of the future human life to come from bringing a fetus to term. So that being said, this is just the most basic kind of philosophical overview of the kinds of reasoning that's implicated in abortion discussions. And I hope that this will give you some food for thought and some cannon fodder for engaging in your very perilous abortion discussions. That's it for this lecture. I hope it's been somewhat interesting. Consider checking out any of my other lectures on postmodernism, German idealism, gender theory, post-colonial studies, and other literature. You can become a channel member for $5 a month and gain access to, among other things, a private philosophy Zoom, which you can tailor to your needs. I also have super thanks if you'd just like to donate to the channel, because books are not cheap, and I appreciate everyone who decides to donate to this channel, but no pressure. That's it for this lecture, and I will see you in another one.